Hello, welcome to Behind the Wall. I'm Stan Grant. To say the last 4 years have been turbulent for the US-China relationship would be an understatement. Donald Trump's presidency has seen an escalation of tensions, a trade war, the closure of consulates in both countries, and ongoing anger over the fallout from the coronavirus. Now, the American election is less than a week away, and while polling indicates challenger Joe Biden will be the next resident of the White House, the 2016 election taught us that anything can happen. Bonnie Glaser is a senior advisor for Asia at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and she joins me now. Bonnie Glaser, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with how you see the future of the US-China relationship in many respects, regardless of who wins this election.
Well, I think that the frame of strategic competition between the U.S. and China is really deeply entrenched now. It was, of course, created early in the Trump administration, but I don't think there's really any turning back. There may be cooperation going forward on some issues where we have some shared interests, such as maybe climate change or even global health and pandemics. But I really think that there is this intense friction now in so many domains between the U.S. and China. It's in economics and trade and technology, in addition to military and more traditional realms.
And I was reminded at the last debate, and the one before that as well, if anyone thinks that there's going to be a fundamental shift if Joe Biden wins, they're wrong. Joe Biden has accused China of perfecting the art of the steal, as he described it, and the last debate actually flat out called Xi Jinping a thug.
Yes, he did. He used fairly tough language to describe Xi Jinping. And I think that this reflects, first and foremost, his own experience with Xi Jinping. When he was vice president, he met with Xi Jinping a number of times, traveled with him around China and in the United States. And he saw how China under Xi Jinping broke some of its promises to the United States. And so he really has an experience himself, and he knows that we should not underestimate China and the challenges that it poses.
So in this case, was Donald Trump right to take on China, to draw that line in the sand in 2017, declaring China a strategic competitor, saying that the single biggest threat to the United States was indeed China, and then, of course, trying to rebalance the trade relationship, ending up in that trade war? It cost America in the short term, but looking further ahead, was he right to take China on?
Well, I would say, yes, his administration was right, because that was a strategy that was really designed and implemented by the people around him. Frankly, President Trump focused like a laser on the bilateral trade deficit in the U.S.-China relationship and has just worked to get China to buy more products from the United States. But I don't see any evidence that President Trump fully bought in to the broad threats that China poses and concern about stealing technology and building islands in the South China Sea, cracking down in Hong Kong, imprisoning people in Xinjiang. I just don't see much evidence that President Trump really prioritized those issues.
Indeed, Donald Trump said, didn't he, that he had a partner in Xi Jinping. He raved about their personal relationship, and he saw this as someone that he could do a deal with, and he loves to do deals.
Yes, Donald Trump has been very transactional in most of the things that he has dealt with other countries about, and China is no exception. He's talked very positively about his best friend, Xi Jinping, and that actually lasted until COVID-19 hit the United States. And then Donald Trump really turned on Xi Jinping. And now the relationship is probably at the lowest point it has ever been.
Going forward, Bonnie, what is the better bet here? Is it Donald Trump who wins and then continues to pressure China, but at the same time makes the most of that relationship, tries to rekindle that relationship with Xi Jinping, to work on the things that divide them? Or is it better with Joe Biden, who pushes against China and then builds those stronger relationships with allies, those other countries that have some real skin in the game here? Is that what we're seeing now? Is that a better outcome, to build those alliances, or a Donald Trump approach?
Well, my view is that the Trump administration, although they have assessed the challenges that China poses quite correctly, that they haven't been very effective in changing China's behavior or responding to those threats. And this is in part because sometimes they've been very confrontational, talked about actually the desire for regime change in China, which I don't think has won the trust in any way of anybody in China. And it's scared our allies and partners. And if we are to deal with the challenges that China poses, and not just the United States, but I would say democracies and so many of China's neighbors and other countries in the world, we're going to have to work together. We have to reinvigorate multinational, multilateral institutions. We have to rebuild the international order where it's not serving us well, such as in the World Trade Organization. But the Trump administration has really walked away from these institutions. It's withdrawn from the World Health Organization. It's undermined the WTO, and it's been very unilateralist. So I think that Biden's approach of working with allies and partners and trying to forge a more cooperative way among the like-minded countries to deal with China, I think has a better chance of success.
Bonnie, if I could turn your attention to Australia. It's often been said that Australia is the canary in the coal mine, if you like, caught between this moment of history, the big power rivalry between China and the United States. Our biggest trading partner is China, but our great friend and strategic ally is the United States. Is it down to countries now, like Australia, middle power countries, to really chart their own course?
Well, I think that all countries, and Australia certainly included, need to develop their own assessment of China and then develop a strategy based on their own interests. And Australia's approach to China and the toughening of that approach, I think, is in large part a function of the Chinese interference in Australia's politics and society. It's not because the Trump administration has been arm twisting Australian leaders. And so there are areas that, because of Australia's evolving view of China, that we can and should work together on, and protecting supply chains, and particularly protecting advanced technology, working together to, as I said, strengthen the rules-based international order. Those are areas where I think that there's great prospects for working together. But I don't think that countries should be forced to choose between the United States and China. There are going to be areas where we're going to have differences because we're two separate sovereign nations. And maybe there are times when Australia will work very well with other countries or in other minilateral mechanisms, such as with Japan and India. The United States doesn't have to be present everywhere. But I think if we're all sort of marching in the same direction, we have the same goals, then we can work with some differences on issues. That shouldn't be a problem.
One of the big questions about China is whether it can be incorporated into a global order, an institutional-based order. And to some degree, that's already happened. We know that China is a member of the World Trade Organization. It's a member of the Permanent Five Security Council at the United Nations. So it is part of a global structure. But at the same time, it challenges a lot of that order right now. Can it be incorporated into that order, or are we going to see rising tensions, containment, competition, and potentially even the threat of conflict?
Well, I would start by saying that China is not Russia. It does not want to overthrow the entire international order. China's benefited more than any country in the world from the post-World War II international order, and particularly institutions like the United Nations, where it sits as a permanent member of the Security Council. But yes, China's long talked about the world order being unjust and wanting to make changes, and we should figure out what the changes are that China wants and whether that serves the interests of other countries. When it comes to things like introducing new norms into Human Rights Council at the United Nations, personally, I'm worried about that. I don't think that human rights should be defined simply as the people's living standard, because we believe, I think, as Western nations, then in freedoms and the right of people to have free access to information. China's view of cyber sovereignty is just very different than I think those of the democratic countries in the world. So there may be areas where we can make some modifications, then there should be other areas that we stand firm to protect what we think is important in the international order. But regarding your question about the Cold War, I think that this is different than the U.S.-Soviet Cold War in so many ways. Massive people-to-people exchanges and trade between the United States and China. But there are also elements that are similar. I increasingly see an ideological component U.S.-China competition. And frankly, that's worrisome. China is trying to promote not only the viability of its own authoritarian system, but also trying to strengthen other authoritarian systems around the world. And it is using disinformation to try and spread this narrative that democracy is failing and that their governance system is better than ours. So there are some elements of the Cold War that I think are actually similar.
Bonnie, I think you've really touched on something there, and that is this idea of ideology, and I share that concern with you, and that really brings us to Xi Jinping and how Xi Jinping sees the world. He is, in many respects, the most powerful leader China has ever had, even more powerful than Mao, because China is a more powerful country. He is someone who believes in China returning to the apex of power. He is very ideological. How much of what we're seeing here right now is Xi Jinping himself, someone who is now essentially president for life? Is that how we have to see China? Very much through the prism of Xi Jinping as the leader and how he sees the world.
Well, Xi Jinping was brought to power by a system, by the Chinese Communist Party, which had been weakened, a great deal of corruption in particular, under the prior leader, Hu Jintao. So I think that there was great support for Xi Jinping to be a stronger leader. He probably has gone further than many people expected he would, especially eliminating the term limits. And now he will start probably his next 5-year term in 2022. I don't know for certain that he will remain as leader for life. But I do think that there's more he wants to do as China's general secretary of the party. And so I think he'll be there for a 3rd term. And I think he's become a very important factor. He's very ambitious. He's laid out deadlines, some objectives that China should achieve by 2035 and 2049. The latter, of course, is the goal for national rejuvenation of China. He has certainly fed the nationalistic narrative in China and used, I think, the criticism from abroad to forge party unity in support of his agenda. I'd also say that he's less risk averse than prior Chinese leaders. And we see this in the area of many foreign policy issues, and particularly sovereignty disputes around China, which he has been quite sensitive about. And he has said, no, not 1 inch of territory will ever be taken from China. So whether we're talking about the South China Sea, the border with India, or Taiwan, or the East China Sea and the dispute with Japan, Xi Jinping is not afraid of pushing forward his agenda and taking advantage of opportunities. And I think that he believes that the United States is in decline as a power. And this started with the global financial crisis before he came to power, but COVID-19 has also been an accelerant. And I think that is also quite worrisome for the rest of us going forward.
Bonnie, again, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. We could talk for hours about this. Thank you again for being generous with your time.
Thank you.